rings. They're very faint. This image obviously took some computer processing to show all this stuff. And we also were able to show that Uranus has some bands in its clouds. The surprise is that it's all going the wrong way. Notice this ring goes up and down. I don't have the photograph rotated. This is how it actually is out in space. Whereas all the other planets rotate more or less in an up and down direction. In other words, that they spin like a top as they go around the sun. Uranus is sideways. It rolls along like a ball as it goes around the sun. Now, this does not match that swirling cloud of gas and dust model that we talked about. You were supposed to have the bigger cloud all going the same direction, and then smaller local swirls would form going on all the planets. Remember, that was one of the proofs of the theory, right? Because all the planets are going in the same direction and doing all this nice, neat stuff. Well, as we study them a little closer, they're not doing that at all. So this creates a real problem for evolution. Now, who wants to guess? Right. Uranus formed the way evolution predicted, you understand, but then a big rock came along and hit it and knocked it over. Anybody detecting a trend here? Models for the development of the solar system cannot produce such an orientation, that laying over on the side business, without invoking a collision with another object. The problem is that Uranus shows no evidence whatsoever for such a collision. First of all, Uranus's orbit is one of the most circular of all the planets, showing no evidence of having been walloped hard enough to knock the whole thing over. I mean, remember how big Uranus was compared to the Earth? Big object, right? You need a huge collision to do that. Also, Uranus's orbit lies more closely within the ecliptic plane than any other planet except Earth, again showing no evidence of such a catastrophe in the past. You also have a problem with the moons. The moons, back up a minute, the moons of Uranus all orbit this way. In other words, they used to be this way, but when the equator got moved, when the whole planet got pushed over, the moons are here now. Now you have a question, well, did the moons form before or after this supposed collision? If they formed before, how did you move them from doing this to doing that? Which you can't, obviously. But if they formed after, well, how come they're orbiting the equator here and not some sort of chaotic pattern as a result of the spray pattern of fragments that came out, which they supposedly came from? You also have a problem in that if you say they were formed after the collision, then all of the moons combined are only 0.1% of the mass of the planet. And the collision that was invoked to explain the Earth's moon has the moon being 1.2%. So you see there's a real discrepancy between the model, the collision that supposedly produced the Earth's moon, and the collision that would have had to produce Uranus's moons. Basically, the moons shouldn't be there doing what they're doing. Other problems that this planet presents. Why doesn't it radiate energy? All the other gas planets do. Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune all radiate more energy into space than they get from the sun. Uranus doesn't. If these things formed at the same time, in the same place, in the same materials, in the same processes, why ain't they doing the same thing? Worse than that, quote, to the complete astonishment of scientists, the magnetic axis of Uranus is tilted approximately 60 degrees with respect to its axis of rotation. It is not known why. In other words, the magnetic field for this planet is causing problems, just as all the rest of them have. In this case, it's because the magnetic field is not lined up with the planet's rotation. And as the cherry on top of the cake, the axis is also offset from the center of the planet. Uranus has some moons. One of this is Miranda, which one of my favorite objects in the solar system, I think. Maybe I can convince you to believe that as well. Miranda is a tiny object. It's only about 300 miles across. But look at all the different kinds of terrain that are in this little tiny object here. You have grooved terrain up here with a very neat boundary, which I guess the big screen isn't really showing up all that well. You have heavily cratered terrain here, lightly cratered terrain here that's smoother. You have coarsely grooved terrain down here. You have cliffs over here, which I'll talk about in a minute. You have like a trapezoid here with very sharp edges and a big check mark in the middle of it. Like the creator said, let them figure this one out. Maybe it's space art. I mean, look at this. Nice smooth terrain, and then, I mean, you can almost draw the line here. Like someone ran a paintbrush down the edge of it. It also has the highest cliff in the solar system. It's about 6 miles high, this thing right here. Imagine standing on the edge and looking down. Now, if you were the evolutionist trying to explain how this thing formed all by itself, how would you like to get this job? Just in this one picture, you get the paintbrush thing up here, you get the check mark here, the different colors, and like I said, look how sharp that line is. We don't normally see sharp lines like this in nature. People draw them, but things like this don't usually happen by themselves. So pity the poor evolutionist who has to explain this thing, really. No one predicted anything looking like Miranda. Well, there's an understatement from an evolutionist. Another guy said, the central problem in modeling the thermal histories of the Uranian satellites is accounting for Miranda. Who wants to guess the answer? Yep. Let's see, I clicked the button. Okay, here's your tax dollars at work. Here's a quote from a NASA website. Scientists believe that Miranda may have been shattered as many as 5 times during its evolution. One collision couldn't do it. We need 5. After each shattering, the moon would have reassembled from the remains of its former self with portions of the core exposed and portions of the surface buried. And then the author has a wave of guilt and is actually honest and says, Miranda's appearance can be explained by theories, but the real reason is still unknown. So they're saying you got to break this thing up and reassemble it 5 different times. Another guy notes that although some sort of collisional disruption appears to be required, it is not obvious that the present terrain, with relief up to 20 kilometers, would survive catastrophic disruption and reassembly. He's saying that dramatic terrain I showed you with all the cliffs and all the rest of it, he said if you smash this thing into pieces, then you're not going to have this type of thing afterwards. So here's what you aren't being told about Uranus. The sideways rotation disproves evolution. Its magnetic field disproves evolution. It should be radiating energy, but isn't. And Miranda is a complete mystery. Next up is Neptune. How are we doing on time? How old is Neptune? 4.5 billion years old, right? More or less. It's old, cold, and dead, just like all the rest of the things we've been looking at. None of the above, as it turns out. Neptune is the furthest large planet from the Sun. It's 30 times as far away as Earth is. So it's in a very cold place. But it isn't cold. It radiates twice the energy into space that it receives from the Sun. Nor is it dead. That spot right here, the great spot, has disappeared since the first time we started taking pictures. Neptune's atmosphere is changing. It's very dynamic. It's acting very young, not at all like something that cooled off billions of years ago. In fact, Neptune is actually the most violent place in the solar system. We've clocked winds there at 1,300 miles an hour. Can't even imagine what that would be like. And there's yet another magnetic problem for evolutionists posed by this planet. In 1986, the Voyager probe discovered Uranus's magnetic field was tilted and offset, like I mentioned a few minutes ago. At the time, scientists suggested that Voyager had caught the field in the middle of a reversal, which is when the magnetic poles switch places. So maybe that explained the weird field. But then 3 years later, Voyager visited Neptune and found out that Neptune's field is doing the same thing. So it seems that the possibility of finding 2 planets both experiencing these reversals is small. In other words, you can invoke a miracle on the first one, but you can't invoke the same thing happening at the same time for someone else. Now, it's interesting because a creationist physicist, Dr. Russell Humphreys, had successfully predicted the strength of both of these fields before they were measured by basing his model on the Bible. Based on 2 Peter and some other passages, he postulated that all the planets were originally formed out of water. That would have certain implications for their original magnetic field, which would have caused leftover remnant magnetism today. And they all laughed at him because his predictions were 100,000 times greater than evolutionist predictions, but it turns out when we actually got there, he was right, they were wrong. Oh, and by the way, neither of those planets we've been talking about, Uranus and Neptune, they don't exist. Here's a quote from Astronomy Magazine. Astronomers who model the formation of the solar system have kept a dirty little secret from you. Uranus and Neptune don't exist. Or at least computer simulations have never explained how planets as big as the 2 gas giants could form so far from the Sun. Bodies orbited so slowly in the outer parts of the Sun's protoplanetary disk, that gas and dust disk, that the slow process of gravitational accretion would need more time than the age of the solar system to form bodies with such big mass. Now, you'd think 4.5 billion years would be enough time, wouldn't you? Nope. What is clear is that simple banging together of planetesimals to construct planets takes too long in this remote outer part of the solar system. The time needed exceeds the age of the solar system. We see Uranus and Neptune, but the modest requirement that these planets exist has not been met by this model. By the way, everybody I'm quoting in this presentation is evolutionist. I meant to say that up front.